Welcome back to the In Chamber. I'm your host, Tom Schumann. Yes, it's the early days of a new decade, and much of the focus is on looking ahead. We do a great deal of that here at the Chamber, whether it's through our Indiana Vision 2025 Economic Development Plan, our policy emphasis on technology and entrepreneurship, or a variety of other programs and initiatives. But we also enjoy looking back, and we did so once again in the current issue of BizVoice magazine. Our efforts, as always, when we take that step back in time, were supported by the guidance and the assistance from the team at the Indiana Historical Society. We encourage you to check out the issue, including a one-on-one conversation with Indiana Historical Society President Jody Blankenship. We're going to stay focused on Indiana history today with our guest. He's senior editor at the Indiana Historical Society Press, and author of at least a dozen books and counting, I believe, on Indiana history. Ray Boomhower, welcome to the In Chamber.
Tom, glad to be here, and we're up to 18 books now.
18 books.
As of in February, the 18th of my books will be released.
Well, I have that. We'll ask you about that one in a little bit, but yeah, the number has jumped. That is tremendous.
It's been a great ride. I've been fortunate to be at the Indiana Historical Society, as I like to say, for more than 30 years. Don't want to date myself, but it's been quite a while. And it's been a great opportunity to learn more about Indiana and its history, particularly through my work with Traces Magazine, which is the quarterly magazine of the Indiana Historical Society.
Well, that's where I want to start, Ray, is 30 years of that publication. You've been there from day one as part of that team. Traces of Indiana and Midwestern History, great publication. Talk about that journey for you, what it's meant over that 30-year period to be involved with such a great outlet.
Well, as you said, I've been involved from the beginning. When Traces first came out in 1989 as a benefit of membership in the Indiana Historical Society, it was a way for the society to reach out to a broader audience. Society had been focused a lot on scholarly history about Indiana, but we thought there was more to be covered in a popular nature, and that's where Traces came to be. Its first editor was Kent Calder, and he was assisted by his assistant editor, Megan McKee, who I later married and has been my editor and wife now for quite a long time.
I read, Ray, where you said, any great writer or author, great thing to do is marry an editor.
Marry an editor. So. It worked for me, so that's the best advice that I can give to any writer. But I was involved from the first, and coming up, we did a statewide blitz on having a Name That Magazine contest. And 3 people, I think it was, came up with the name of Traces. And we broadened it to include Traces of Indiana and Midwestern history, because the thought was way back then that we eventually run out of stories to do just about Indiana. But that has not been the case. All of the articles that appear in Traces over the years have had a focus on the Hoosier State. So Kent was the editor for the first 10 years of the magazine, and he left the society in 1999, and I was lucky enough to take over. I had been writing for it during Kent's editorship, and he was very important in getting me involved in the magazine, and that's something I've always remembered him fondly for.
You mentioned the fear or the concern initially of running out of stories to tell. That's when we approach a BizVoice magazine, whether it's on history or other topics, you sit there and go, gosh, we're only covering just a little bit. We try to do that in the current issue, but as you think about Indiana business history over the years, what are some of the things that stand out to you? And I know it's the impossible question, we could talk for hours and hours about that, but a few things that stand out about business history in this state.
Well, the first thing that springs to mind, because I'm from Mishawaka, Indiana, in the northern part of the state, Michiana. Growing up in that part of the state, we always were focused a lot on the history of the automobile in Indiana, particularly with the contributions of Studebaker and Bendix in South Bend, Indiana, but also looking to the history of the Auburn, Cord, Duesenberg automobiles from that part of the state over by Fort Wayne, Indiana. And of course, as I came to Indianapolis and worked here, the Lilly Company was a big part of the stories that we told in Traces and also in our book program. Jim Madison, who was, of course, an Indiana University professor of history, did, I think, the definitive biography of Eli Lilly, and the Indiana Historical Society was lucky enough to publish that in association with Indiana University Press. And in the pages of Traces, we've also featured the history of the industries that grew up out of the gas boom of central Indiana during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The growth of Ball Brothers.
I talk often about Ball State and the Ball Brothers and Muncie. I actually had an opportunity, Ray, to after I left newspapers, before I came here to the Indiana Chamber, I worked for a year at Minnetrista Cultural Center.
Great
I
organization.
had a chance to work with Ed Ball as he was writing a couple of his books. And what a great man, him and his wife and the whole family, obviously. But that was really a highlight for me to be able to have that opportunity at a young age to learn and share in some of the experiences that he had that not only incorporated Indiana history, but really went beyond that.
Right. And then if you look at the history of World War II and the growth of industry during that time period in the state, you had everything from P-47 Thunderbolts being built in Indiana to landing craft out of Evansville down on the Ohio River that did so much to win the war for the U.S. and its allies during World War II. And there are other smaller stories that we've been lucky to tell in Traces magazine. I wrote a piece a number of years ago about the efforts of a local businessman in Indianapolis named William Powers Hapgood, who had the Columbia Conserve Company. It was a soup-making company, and it was really a industrial democracy workshop. He was one of the first businessmen to turn over its operation to the workers who ran the plant themselves and were able to eventually own the operation. So that was an interesting story and intriguing part of Indiana's history that is not well known these days.
Yeah, in Indiana today, Indiana's a leader in what's commonly known as the ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans. So maybe a predecessor of those that you wrote about years ago. In our current issue, you talk about how much a business means to a community. With your help connecting us to some of the historians around the state, we did stories on International Harvester in Fort Wayne, RCA in Bloomington, those relationships and just how deep they went.
And going back to South Bend and how those relationships are torn apart sometimes when a company that's been a part of a community for many, many years and is really a part of the fiber of a city or a town closes, and people are wondering, what's going to happen next, and will the community survive? And those stories are still being, unfortunately, told today with a lot of communities in the Midwest and around the country.
Ray, you mentioned you grew up in Mishawaka. I've read a couple places where you first learned your love of history. If you would share that with our listeners and kind of how that ties into to another part of your work today, some of the books you have written. Right.
Well, I was lucky enough to have a teacher in third grade. I still remember her name, Patricia Swarm, who was very influential in my love and interest in history and biography in particular. Of course, back in those days, we did a lot of classroom readings where you had to read aloud from the assigned text, which always bored me to tears. So I always wanted to know what was going to happen next. So I read ahead in the textbook, and Miss Swarm could have, scolded me for doing that, but instead she realized that I was someone who really loved books and loved history and encouraged me to read all I could on those subjects. And I was lucky enough to have in our school library these old, what were called the Childhood of Famous Americans series. It was published by Bobbs Merrill Company, publishing firm of Indianapolis. And these were small books that told the stories of famous Americans like Andrew Jackson, Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Jane Addams, and they were very well written, had a lot of dialogue, a lot of interesting stories about these famous Americans, with these fabulous black woodcut drawings of scenes of these people's lives. Later, I understood that a lot of these, the dialogue and the discussions in these books were invented, but they still drew me into a real love of history and biography, and that I think has really been a part of my life ever since, and got me interested in history and writing about history.
Yeah, and so many of the books you've done now, the Historical Society, the Youth Biography series, talk a little bit about that, some of the work that you've been able to do there.
Well, one of the things that we were influenced by was a book by Thomas Friedman, who is a well-known young adult nonfiction writer. And I was very impressed by a book he did called Lincoln, a Photobiography. And it was a book that mixed interesting narrative history about Lincoln's life with a lot of great historic images. And I thought, well, that's something we could do for people from the Hoosier State as well. So we started the Youth Biography series when I moved over to the Publications Division at the Indiana Historical Society, featuring notable Hoosiers and using the extensive collection of images that we have at the Historical Society's William Henry Smith Memorial Library. You know, we have more than 1.5 million images from all eras of Indiana's history.
I think Jody pointed out in our interview, beyond the images, about 8 million items hanging around at the Historical Society.
A lot of content that we can draw upon, and been lucky enough to draw upon for our publications and our periodicals at the Indiana Historical Society. So we used that and teamed up with a variety of authors who could tell the stories of these notable people from the Hoosier State, and I've been lucky enough to write a few in the series myself. The most recent came out in 2018. It was a book called Mr. President, A Life of Benjamin Harrison that we coordinated with the Benjamin Harrison Presidential Site here in Indianapolis. So we're mixing together, you know, a concise life story about these famous people from Indiana with a lot of intriguing, we think interesting images from their life and their times. And we've discovered that although these books are geared toward a middle school to high school audience, people of all ages like reading them because, as I say, they tell a good story. They give you all the information you want. Format that works very well.
Yeah. So Benjamin Harrison, Ernie Pyle, General Wallace. So we did a previous story. We visited the General Wallace Study and Museum in Crawfordsville, but you did a book. Yeah. Things that stand out about any of those or some of the other subjects you've been able to profile?
Well, Lew Wallace is great, and if you are in Crawfordsville, I encourage you to stop by the Lew Wallace Study and Museum and realize that this is not his home. He didn't live here. This is where he went to read and write. It shows you the power of having a best-selling book. Of course, Lew Wallace had Ben-Hur, and he was able to, from the proceeds of that book, build his fabulous study. But some of the lesser-known people that have been featured in the Youth Biography series that spring to mind include a man named Alex Verschue, who was a fighter pilot in World War II. He's from the Indiana Harbor section of East Chicago, Indiana. Someone I found in an old issue of Trace's magazine on the history and contributions of Indiana during World War II. And I thought his was a fascinating story and should be told to a new generation. Hadn't been told in book form before. He was a very self-effacing person, although he was a leading U.S. Navy ace in the Pacific at one time during World War II, who was someone who did not like to toot his own horn. First reluctant to talk to me, but when he heard that it was for a younger audience, he agreed to talk to me, so I went out he retired in the Bay Area of California, and I spent a couple of days with him, and it was just a fascinating story about his experiences during the war and also afterwards. So I like telling stories about people from Indiana who made major contributions not only to the state but to the Midwest and the nation as well, and he was certainly someone who did so.
Got to ask you about somebody who came to Indiana on the political side of the equation and major impacts of events that took place. Robert Kennedy in the 1968 election. You had a chance to write a book about that primary election, and just the significance of his presence here in Indiana during that time. Share a few thoughts about that, if you would.
Well, they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, in my case, really, an image was worth about 90,000 words, because it was an image of Robert F. Kennedy speaking in Indianapolis to a political rally at 17th and Broadway streets. An image of him speaking with a microphone in front of him that was in the collection of the IHS library. That got me thinking about, why was Robert F. Kennedy in Indianapolis at that momentous time in the country's history? What drew him here? Well, of course, he was here to kick off his campaign for the presidency. Indiana was the first primary state available for him to run in. He wanted to test his insurgent candidacy against incumbent President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1968. And so he was in Indiana on April 4th, 1968, stopping off first in South Bend at Notre Dame to campaign, going on from there to your own Ball State University to give a speech at the men's gym. And from there, he was coming to Indianapolis, opening up his new campaign headquarters, and there to go to 17th and Broadway streets for a campaign rally when the news came about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So that really got me inspired to write about not only that speech that he gave, an impromptu, off-the-cuff, from-the-heart talk that really helped calm the situation in Indianapolis. A lot of major American cities were having violence from the news of King's death, but Indianapolis remained quiet. To go in to talk about his month-long campaign here in Indiana, where he ran against not only Johnson at first, but he dropped out. And then he was left to run against Eugene McCarthy, another insurgent candidate, and Indiana's own Roger Brannigan, who was a fascinating figure in his own right. So all these people came together in order for me to write about Kennedy's campaign here in 1968.
And I guess we think about the Kennedys in Indiana, and I believe Jody shared this story when we were talking about Indiana history of John F. Kennedy. And one of his first stops was at Notre Dame also to kind of, as you say, test that candidacy and overcome a lot of those doubts about whether he could be a viable candidate. And he said, well, I'm going right to the home of the Catholics, so to speak, at
right.
Notre Dame.
Yes, it was intriguing. And when in 1968, Ted Kennedy was here, setting up things for his brother Robert when he heard the news that Lyndon Johnson was not seeking the nomination for presidency. So he was walking around the streets of downtown Indianapolis saying, what else is going to happen this year? He didn't know, of course, that more tragedy would befall the Kennedy family later on when his brother was assassinated after the California primary.
Right. Ray mentioned book number 18 coming out soon, titled To Be Hoosiers, Historic Stories of Character and Fortitude. Give our listeners a sneak peek of that, if you would. What's the focus of that
It's
latest
really
effort?
a collection of pieces I've done over my 30 years in Indiana history, looking at different aspects of people and themes and events from Indiana's history. Everything from General Lew Wallace and his role during the Civil War in stopping a Confederate attack from actually threatening our nation's capital during the end of the war at the Battle of Monocacy, to situations during World War II at Seymour Field in Indiana. We had an airfield there training pilots for service during the war, and a number of African American pilots were there. There was an incident involving not being allowed to use a white officers club that was a major civil rights event in our nation's history that not a lot of people know about, that happened right here in Indiana. So telling those stories of interesting people and events from our state's past that I think people should know more about.
Ray, we talked about schools earlier, your love of history and the youth biography series. Do you feel there's the same appreciation or attention to history Whether we're talking schools or whether we're talking the public in general, is that still there, or is there something maybe missing a little bit?
Probably always should be more emphasis on history, I believe. History gives you the basics for critical thinking, which I think is so important today in not only our country but around the world as well. And it seems that we're teaching, I'm not an expert in education policy, but teaching to tests, ISTEP and all the other tests that students seem to have to take these days, standardized testing. And I think they need to know more about not only their state's history, but their community history. I think that might be lacking, because that's what really, I think, gets young people interested in history as a subject. Knowing more about the people who lived before they did in a town, in a city, knowing more that this happened in this place, and now you're a part of it as well. And I think that's something that should be more connections with local historical societies, which do so much great work with non-paid and volunteer staff all over the state. And that history is available, getting young people involved in programs like our Indiana History Day, where they can do projects and papers and performances about people and events from Indiana.
Well, we talk about civic engagement and how important that is, and Indiana ranks very highly in a number of areas. You look at our volunteerism, our charitable contributions, but one that's lacking is voter turnout. And I don't know, maybe it's a stretch making that connection to history, maybe not, but they all seem to kind of play a factor in how much having that appreciation for the past to help understand your role in determining our future.
And Indiana has a long history in being very involved in national politics and in local politics as well. Politics at one time was really an entertainment. It's a way for people to get involved in their communities, in the state as well. And there's just so many other opportunities for entertainment these days, from a phone that you can hold in your hand to computer screens to thousands of programs on television, that we've lost those connections to the past that I think are important to have.
Well, Ray, we talked before we started recording. You and I share a journalism background, having worked in newspapers, including both of us at Anderson, although at different times. But as you look at the way the newspaper industry's changed over these last 20, 30 years since we've been directly involved, and the rise of social media, any thoughts on that, and how that relates to history? We seem to be in an immediate society today. Does that have an impact on that appreciation or that understanding of history?
I think it does, and I think it's a shame, because journalism and writing for a small town newspaper was vital training for me in my career in Indiana history. It gave me the background I needed to do the work that I do today. The skills of talking to people, interviewing them, doing research, and it's a way for people to connect with one another in small towns throughout Indiana. I've been encouraged, but I think a lot of community papers are surviving, where the larger papers are maybe falling away, losing staff. But people still want to know what's happening in their own communities. And small town newspapers are a way of finding out and discovering and connecting with one another. So I hope that they remain strong and vibrant in Indiana.
A quick anecdote. So I grew up in southeastern Indiana, a very small town near the Cincinnati area. And there's a very small, I believe it's a weekly community paper there. And what they do is if you take their paper and you go travel internationally, whatever, snap your picture with the paper, and they put it on the front page of the newspaper, so-and-so holding the newspaper in whatever country they might be in. Just an example of what people are interested in, local journalism to the ultimate.
Yeah, I remember my days at Indiana University in Bloomington, and at the Union there were these wooden cubby holes, and they were filled with copies of newspapers from all over the state. So if you anywhere you were from, you could go to the Union, take a break, and read what was happening in your hometown. And I asked my niece, who's a student at IU, if those were still available, and I don't think they are anymore. Unfortunately not. No. Yeah. So we've lost that.
Ray, you talked about the inspiration for some of the books have come from many of the items at the Historic Society. And we talk here about what are some of the keys to writing for the magazine and the research and the listening. But when it comes to writing a book, what's the biggest challenge, or what do you have to overcome to kind of take it from idea to fruition?
One of the big problems is to find a subject that you're going to be interested in spending all that time with, sometimes years, when you're writing a person's biography. So I always think of advice that David McCullough gave. Before writing his book, best-selling book about President Truman, he was supposed to write a book about Pablo Picasso, the abstract painter. And as he got more involved in the project, did more research on Picasso's life, came to realize that he couldn't stand the man and didn't like spending time with him, and decided to beg his publishers let him write about anyone else. Well, they just said, okay, how about Harry Truman? And of course, he really enjoyed spending time going through Truman's papers, dealing with all the people who knew him. So you're not always going to have that luxury that David McCullough had. But if you're going to pick a subject, pick someone that you're going to least respect and enjoy spending time with. And that's something that I've tried to do. And also pick subjects that I had some kind of connection with. So I've written a lot about, ex-newspaper reporters, such as John Bartlow Martin, one of the biographies I've written, who was a newspaper reporter in Indianapolis, grew up here as well. People like Juliet Strauss, who was a female columnist for her hometown Rockville Tribune newspaper, wrote a column for the Indianapolis News and also for the Ladies' Home Journal, and had that small-town experience of dealing with her fellow citizens as the owner of a local newspaper. I have a long-time interest in World War II. That grew into my books about Alex Verschue, John Buscemi, who was also from the region in Indiana and was a photographer for Yank magazine during the war, and lost his life in the Pacific, just like Ernie Pyle did as well. So you got to make those personal connections when you're doing the long-scale book projects that I do.
So, Ray, writing can be very consuming as part of your job, part of your spare time, so to speak, if you're working on things outside of the Historic Society. What are some other things you like to do, hobbies or things that you do when you do have free time?
Well, because we live in Indianapolis and we have a dog, my wife and I do a lot of walking, and we're lucky enough to live not too far away from the Monon Trail. So the trail systems in central Indianapolis have been a great boon to us, and I think everyone who lives in central Indianapolis. So walking it is a big hobby. Of course, visiting historic sites, because that's sometimes where you get inspiration for articles or that I want to do, or I want to assign to others for Traces magazine.
Anything on the bucket list that you have not visited, historically speaking, that you would like to go?
Grand Canyon is a place I've always wanted to go for, as far as one of this country's, sites of wonder, I think. Also, I haven't been to Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, or Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home. So those are still in my future, I hope.
Absolutely. So, Ray, last question as we wrap up. It's a surprise for you, but hopefully those who listen have become used to this by now. This season of the In Chamber, we're asking people about success and what it means to you. Now, it could be job related, it could be personal, but as you think about it, if someone's going to ask you, what does success mean to you? How would you answer that?
I think success means to me in the field that I'm in, that something I've written or something I've helped be written, if it goes into a person's home or if they come across it and they read it, experience it, and say to themselves, wow, I didn't know that about a particular subject. that sense of discovery and wonder, that wow factor that I like to call it, is something that I find, if it does happen, I think I've done something worthwhile and feel a success in having that happen.
You can't get much better than a wow, can you? That's great.
It's pretty good.
Absolutely. Ray, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Again, and our appreciation to you and everybody at the Historical Society for your assistance with us as we tried to touch on a bit of Indiana business history.
It's a great staff, and they do a wonderful job.
All right. Well, you've just heard a conversation with Ray Boomhower, author and senior editor at the Indiana Historical Society Press. You can learn much more at indianahistory.org. We encourage you to check out the current BizVoice at bizvoicemagazine.com. Just a couple quick chamber items as we wrap up. Coming up on February 11th is the annual Chamber Day dinner. This year's keynote speaker will be General John F. Kelly, a 46-year United States Marine Corps veteran. Now retired, General Kelly served our country in Iraq, served as the head of the United States Southern Command, was acting Secretary of Homeland Security, and served as former White House Chief of Staff in President Trump's administration. You can obtain your table or tickets at indianachamber.com under special events, and again, that's on February 11th. Before that, the week before, we have the 2020 Indiana Business Tax Conference, a new event for the Chamber. It takes place February 5th and 6th at the Hyatt Regency, Indianapolis. This will help companies not only stay in compliance, but ensure as an organization that you're making the most out of potential tax savings. What's coming up on the In-Chamber in the next few months? Education and workforce development discussions, beginning with a visit with Tariq Al-Nasir. Tariq is founder of the STEMnasium, easy for me to say, Learning Academy. So we'll have that conversation for you in 2 weeks, releasing it on February 4th. Thank you as always for listening to the In-Chamber.